Hello everyone, welcome back to my first video after taking almost a 2-month break from YouTube. This is going to be a video around the concept of work. So I guess there isn't like one specific overarching theme I wanted to talk about. Rather, it will be like a mixture of various historical and concurrent ideas, especially criticisms that people have directed towards the idea of work. In general, I'll touch on our general attitude towards it, its social function, its relationship with our personal identities, some current trends, and etc. Let's start with the most basic question. What is work? A Philosopher Looks at Work by Raymond Geuss. For a really long time, I thought like his last name was supposed to be Geuss for some reason. I don't know why, but Raymond Geuss. And basically he considers this question in depth throughout this book. So he starts with the intuition that if we call something work, we think of some physical or mental exertion, usually done for the sake of creating some tangible result, so it may be like producing a good or a service. However, you also tend to think that there are a lot of action which fit such criteria, but clearly we don't think of them as work, such as walking your dog or going shopping. Then it seems like what we call work isn't so much defined by the activity itself, like what sort of activity do we call work, but more like what role does it have in our social life? So Geuss suggests one defining trait of work is that it's something that we do for renumeration, which, in the case of modern society is pretty much all monetary. It's also seen as something that most people need to do out of necessity in order to maintain a reasonable standard of living. Work is also defined in contrast to an opposite concept, which is what we call leisure. Particularly in the modern world, we tend to think of all our activities in terms of the work-leisure binary. So we see that in reality, when you ask people, oh, is this activity work? Or like, what do you see work as? There is generally very little ambiguity. Like, people don't tend to be confused about what work is, and they don't tend to disagree either. Why is this the case? Well, it's because most of what we call work is organized. What I mean is that most activities that we call work fall under some form of organization, such as the employment contract. And even for those that don't sit under some sort of formal legal structured employment contract, such as babysitting your neighbor's kid, there usually is some form of structure or rules regarding the scope of tasks you're expected to do and how you're supposed to be remunerated. So this is why in everyday life, people never argue over whether this activity is work or that activity is work. The biggest area of contention, actually seems to be like whether you're like a freelance contractor or you're an employee, as seen in a lot of law cases. Even though our society seems to have already done the definition of what is work for us, it doesn't mean that the definition stays rigid and unchanging, and in fact, it's a definition that evolves. So for example, being a YouTuber, considered like a decade ago, wouldn't really be a job according to most people's understanding, but now people can very easily grasp the idea of being a YouTuber as your work. So having clarified what work is, let's move on to the crux of this video, which will be divided in 3 sections. So each section focuses on a different direction of criticism that the concept of work faces. And here's how I aim to divide it. The first section will be the content critique. The second section is the renumeration critique. And the third section is the relational critique. The content critique can be best summarized in one term: bullshit jobs. Coined and popularized by David Graeber in his 2018 book of the same name. So as defined by Graeber, a bullshit job is meaningless or unnecessary wage labor which the worker is obliged to pretend to have a purpose. So why are these jobs problematic? Well, we find them intuitively problematic because people are just naturally inclined to think that work needs to fulfill some meaningful, valuable purpose, whether for the individual or society as a whole. Since people are obviously exerting effort in doing it and people are paid for doing it. So if a job has no value at all, it seems to contradict the very intuition that we have regarding the concept of work. Moreover, it's seen as a waste of human resources. So YouGov, a data analytics firm, polled British people in 2015 about whether they thought that their jobs made a meaningful contribution to society in general. 37% said no, and about 13% were unsure. This shows the severity of the problem that we are dealing with right now. So why do we have bullshit jobs? There's really no answer to the problem, but there are several factors worth considering. Firstly, the idea of unemployment has serious stigma attached to it, whether socially or politically. It seems to be a win-win situation for politicians, corporates, and individuals to have as many people employed as possible. There can be no harm in that, right? Secondly, in our society, many very superfluous jobs, superfluous in terms of content, are very highly paid. The people in those industries have an interest in continuing to maintain the facade that their jobs are very important in order to maintain the prestige. Thirdly, bureaucratic inefficiency exists everywhere, and it's really compounding as the complexity of our society and technological developments increase. And really, where there's red tape, the people that governments and corporations tend to employ in order to deal with red tape kind of just expands like a balloon. Now, the second content-based problem is that of alienation. According to our famous Karl Marx, alienation is a situation where two things that belong together come apart. So translated into the plight of the worker, it's a case where a person's essence becomes detached from his existence, and his existence is the existence of a worker. This is because work is designed in a way that does not properly recognize and express the essence of human beings, which is that we are productive beings. Marx, in fact, outlines quite a few ways in which a worker can be alienated, but I shall only mention two aspects of alienation that are most relevant to the content critique. So first is alienation from productive activity. In the act of production, this relation is the relation of the worker to his own activity as an alien activity not belonging to him. So this form of alienation occurs when people are not allowed to express themselves in some form in their work. The working life becomes suffering, the worker therefore feels outside himself in his work and only feels himself outside of work. Second is alienation from species being. Marx believed that human beings have an essence. We are distinguished by the fact that our labor can and maybe should be creative. Yet, in capitalist society, the majority of labor isn't creative. Hence, it does not express the essence of what it means to be human. Therefore, man is estranged from his own body and his human or spiritual aspect. To accept the Marxian alienation critique requires accepting the premise that humans are productive beings who seek to express their essence in work that allows them to exercise such faculty. In fact, a lot of contemporary critique raised against repetitive or bullshit jobs have swallowed this premise implicitly, because they're really running along with the idea that man cannot find happiness or fulfillment in work unless the work is interesting or meaninful in some way, and work that doesn't allow people to find this sort of fulfillment is what we see as meaningless work that are better off not existing. Okay, again, we have to start with Marx for the section as well, because he's like the OG for criticizing work in capitalist society. So as defined above, work can only be work if it's something done for remuneration. However, it's not the case that all remuneration is fair. So when some remuneration is unfair, we tend to call it exploitation. Now, Marx defines exploitation as a situation where the capitalist extracts more value from the worker's labor in the form of goods than is paid back to the worker in the form of wages. This is what defines capitalism, because it's essentially a system where capitalists profit on what we call the surplus value. So that's Marx's surplus value theory of labor. You can Google that and Google will explain it in great detail, which I won't do. The basic idea is capitalism won't exist if exploitation didn't exist. Among political philosophers now, there is a debate over whether exploitation is a normative or a descriptive term. If it's taken normatively, it's prima facie a bad thing. I know every single philosopher pronounces prima facie differently, and I don't know what's the correct pronunciation because every single one of my supervisors pronounce it differently, so I'm just gonna go with whatever I do. On the flip side, if you take it descriptively, it's merely describing an arrangement of money, its relationship to labor and capital. For contemporary people, well, because in general, almost everyone lives under a capitalist system, we've kind of accepted it as how life is. When you ask people whether, the surplus value theory of labor is a prima facie evil thing, as in exploitative normatively, most people don't tend to think that way. Most people tend to have just accepted this is how things are. So what I can infer from this is I think the majority of people in society understand exploitation descriptively. It's not saying that everyone is happy with how things are, but that everyone has pretty much accepted this is how things are. So if most people take exploitation rather neutrally, but we still, in everyday life and in strikes, talk about the unfairness of remuneration, then what sort of unfairness are we talking about? Let me just run over a few of the typical ways. So the first idea of unfairness is that the wage is insufficient to provide the worker with a reasonable standard of living. So Raymond Geuss has pointed out, even a family in complete destitution may biologically survive. What we attribute to people is the need to lead a life which satisfies at least the minimal conditions of what they take to be a human life, where that is culturally defined. Sometimes this is called a decent life. Therefore, we see that we have this idea of like a decent standard of living, which is really subject to the prosperity and values of a given society. It's up to that society to determine. And it is always adjusted according to times and places. The key rationale behind the idea of a minimum wage is really to protect this minimal decent standard of living for a human. In a given society and value system, it is deemed as simply impossible for people to obtain this standard of living if their income falls below a certain level. Given that most advanced economies do have a minimum wage, the impossibility of sustaining a reasonable standard of living is not so much raised nowadays as a reason for unfairness against, specific corporations' wages, because they might as well just go ask the government to raise the minimum wage. The second argument for unfairness comes in the form of asserting that the wage afforded to employees is too disproportionate compared to the profits pocketed by the employer. So this critique is one of the most popular ones nowadays. If a corporation is pocketing millions, but the average employee on his salary or wage can barely afford to pay his bills, then clearly we have a problem. So the idea of unfairness here is really stemming from the idea that shareholders who are already pretty well off are perceived as not needing that much money compared to the employees who clearly need those money more. And we as humans just have a instinctive moral imperative of giving, the same stuff to those in more dire need compared to those who don't really need the same stuff. The third critique targets the fact that the remuneration received may be disproportionate in relation to the exertion or skills demanded of the worker. This idea is actually the most subjective argument out of all those. Because when people make such claim, they usually cite the amount of physical mental exertion or prior training required for someone to be competent at the job, which, the idea of exertion again is very subjective. So in real life, this sort of argument, even though personally, I feel like they make sense, they definitely make sense, but those sort of arguments don't tend to have a very significant effect in changing pay, because it's very hard to support them with statistical evidence. How are you meant to use any hard stats to justify how difficult your job is? And the other thing is, what really governs wages in the market is supply and demand, as we all know. So arguing for how difficult it is and how tiring your job isn't going to get you more pay if there are 100 people lining up trying to get your job. Now let's move on to the third section, which is the relational critique. So what this means is people can have different sorts of relationships with their jobs. And one area of the critique directed towards the concept of work is critiquing the sorts of relationships that people typically have with their jobs nowadays. So let's start with one basic idea. Occupation as status. A century or two ago, one's status is primarily defined by birth, and it doesn't really change throughout one's life. The rise of the professional middle class, a pathway is opened up for people to climb up the social ladder by entering a certain profession, regardless of what class they were born into. This trend expanded massively in the 20th century with the decline of the aristocratic class after the two world wars. And now we all know that the primary way of identifying someone's class has become their occupation. The consequence here is that work is no longer just work. It's not as simple anymore. It is your social status. It embodies the majority of whatever social assets you have. So your social identity, your networks, your level of respectability, what sort of life you're able to have and what circles you're able to move in. So in other words, what we're seeing now is a massive separation between job title and job content. Most of the time when we try to understand someone on the basis of their job, the latter doesn't really come into our consideration. It's more really what your job title signifies status-wise in the society. Like, we don't really know and we don't really care what specific things you perform in your job. So on top of the rise of occupational discrimination, which this sort of career hierarchy gives rise to, there's some other more subtle, sinister implications. So if a job is abstracted into a symbol, then we no longer care as much about what the actual performance of the job consists of, so long as it simplifies some respectable status or bountiful income. When I was editing, I just realized I said simplifies. And that was just really funny. I don't know why I said that. I felt like I was trying to say symbolize and signify, and somehow it just came out in the middle. And this situation is precisely what enables a lot of high-paying jobs with bullshit content to exist. Those in the job and those striving to get in those jobs don't want the public to realize how useless their content really is. They only want it to maintain this aura of prestige that places these jobs high up in the social ladder. Now, the second sort of relationship one can have with one's job is how the job enters into one's own sense of self-identity. So for example, if this connection is very strong in the case of some people, then this person would literally think of being a lawyer or a mechanic as a central and ineliminable part of how he understands himself as a person. The question of whether society encourages such behavior is actually a very interesting question. It's like muddled, and there's like a double standard here. In his book, Geuss points out that on top of job discrimination based upon content and pay, there's another form of job discrimination which is based upon type. So at the bottom rung of the employment ladder, you have odd jobbing, casual day labor, or what used to be called temping. So this describes a person who has some kind of separate paid employment at least some of the time, but whose work has no continuity at all, and whose employment is insecure even in the short term. Pay is calculated and calibrated by days or even by hours, and is often dispersed at the end of each working day. Next, we have a proper or regular job. So that's a separate activity with relatively fixed hours and working conditions, usually in a separate location with fixed reliable remuneration, measured in months or years rather than days or weeks. It is employment that one can be expected to keep for a reasonable period of time. One receives for it not just a payment, but wages. Higher up on the hierarchy, there is a career. The person who has the career has an attitude of at least minimal commitment towards that employment, a non-superficial engagement with it, and thus that it plays a certain role in the life of the person who embarks on it. So the higher up on this ladder your type of job is, the more society tends to encourage you to incorporate it into your identity. For people who are in part-time jobs, casual jobs, or other jobs that just don't have any sort of career developmental path, society tends to discourage them from identifying with their jobs because it's seen as an act of being unambitious about life and settling for too little. And what portrays this idea really well is a recent best-selling Japanese novel. I have only the Japanese version here, but If you want to check out the English translation, pretty sure it's like everywhere. It's called Convenience Store Human. I think that's the English name. And basically this book gives some interesting treatment to this idea of the career ladder. Particularly Japanese society is extremely into the idea of the career ladder. They even have basically like two names. So you have baito, which is like working in a convenience store as our protagonist does, and it's really, you know, jobs without a prospect of career development, like working in a convenience store, supermarket, or coffee shop, that sort of thing. And then you have seishiki na shushok, which is like your formal job that has a career development and from which it's unlikely that you get fired unless you do something horrible. And for most of the time, it's like a white-collar office job. And the idea is that most Japanese people are expected to aspire to the latter. And if you stay for too long in the former, well, then society thinks you're a failure of a person, which is exactly what the protagonist does, because she's like stayed in a convenience store and happily stayed there till she's like in her 30s, which was a very bad thing in Japanese society, basically. In the middle of the story, because of societal pressure, she quits her convenience store job and tries to find like a formal white-collar job. Her efforts is greeted with the support of everyone around her. However, what was really sinister towards the end of the novel was basically she sees a convenience store and then she walks in and she couldn't help herself, like she couldn't stop herself but start to arrange things in the store. And what she reports feeling is that she feels like she is destined to work in a convenience store, like she could feel the store calling out to her to do things for it. And she suddenly realized that she can't devote her life to anything else but work in a convenience store. The irony here is that we intuitively find it strange and even creepy for someone to have those thoughts about a convenience store job. But if someone tells you, I think it's my calling to be an actor or be a doctor, we'll be like, congratulations. You see the double standard here? So the question here is, why the double standard? Isn't this double standard steeped in our prejudice against lower paying, lower skilled jobs? Well, perhaps some people might argue, you know, being a doctor is so much more challenging intellectually than being a convenience store worker. The latter is so repetitive and boring, and it's just sad for someone to work their entire life. It's not really discrimination, but like the latter is just inherently boring, and it's much harder for people to get psychological fulfillment from the latter compared to the former. I think this can be part of the argument, but that's definitely not the entire story. It is true that some jobs are just more interesting than others. Anyone who's worked in a factory production line or seen people who work there will have to agree with the statement. But I don't think it's the case that all jobs higher up in the career ladder are the more interesting ones. There are countless bullshit jobs which are in reality really boring, but you know, they're like packaged in ways to disguise the fact that they're useless and boring in order to maintain their prestige. People in those jobs and people who proclaim to love those jobs are respected, but in reality, they're probably not very interesting or challenging or psychologically fulfilling. However, the last question I want to finish this video is just ignore the debate about whatever type of job you have and look at the general idea. Is it generally considered a good or bad thing for you to incorporate your job in your personal identity? Nowadays, it seems to be a really orthodox leftist view to say that you shouldn't do it, that you shouldn't live your life like this. It's seen as a form of enslaving oneself to capitalism because you being devoted to your job is precisely what the capitalist wants. And on the contrary, if you're devoted to, you know, your own entrepreneurial or artistic subject, this is met with a greater amount of approval because it's seen as working for oneself, not slaving for the employer. And some other people have also argued that regardless of whatever type of job you have, if you're over devoted to it, then it takes your time and energy away from other things such as your family, friends, and hobbies that are equally worthy of devotion. So this is kind of like the general package argument here, but I think there are a few things to note. Firstly, given the reality of the average person's life, someone who is likely to be an employee and spends the majority of one's life working, it seems unrealistic to not have some minimal level of devotion or attachment to one's job and incorporate it into one's identity to some extent. If one doesn't do it, then as Marx says, one will be necessarily feeling outside of oneself in work, which is not a pleasant life to lead considering the amount of hours each person spends working. It seems like identifying oneself in the worker role is a necessary psychological coping mechanism for a lot of people, given the amount of time that we can't help but spend working. The other important thing to note is that, as we know, there is a decline in community and interpersonal connections in modern society. So it seems cruel to demand of each person to find their key source of fulfillment in some interpersonal connection or bonding activities. People are driven to attach themselves to their jobs because they have no other alternative. And what I see this is like a negative feedback loop, because the more people attach their jobs, the less time they have for building connections, and the less connections they have, and then the more they're driven to their jobs. So it goes like that, and it's really hard to break out of it. But again, I would love to hear your opinion in the comments on the relationship that you think would be most ideal for each person to have towards their job. Thank you for watching this video. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and join the debate in the comments if you're interested.